Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is welcome to the Regeneration series of webinars related to the pandemic. This is our fifth week of this series, and it's the third month of the pandemic. So much has changed in the last 3 months. Last week I said we're fighting a battle or a war on two fronts. And I want to modify those comments and say that really I think we're battling a war on four fronts. Last week I said, it was about our immediate health, or 2 weeks ago, our immediate health and our economy is what we've been, most focused on. But now we can expand that list and we can begin to focus on the second wave that the experts are saying is around the corner, either later this summer or in the fall. And it's going to coincide with the outbreak of traditional flu season. And maybe the last item that we're fighting right now is the emotional toll that this is having on each of us. And do not think for even 1 second that you are immune to this. This is not something that we can just muscle through. Everything may look okay on the outside, but the signs are there. Alcohol use is up over 40%. Use or abuse is up 40%. Child and spousal abuse has gone nuts. And depression, at least episodic depression, is off the charts. There's a ton of anxiety and depression. Well, 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Kevin Gilliland on our program to talk about what we can and should be doing to get through this pandemic in a healthy way. He left us with a wonderful, pithy instruction. And he said, what? Sleep is power, food is fuel, and movement is medicine. Well, today we have two special guests that know about the emotional toll that this impact of the pandemic. And maybe more importantly than just talking about the emotional toll is that how can we each bounce back to what might be a full recovery? Well, we have with us Dr. Michael Cofield. He's a cognitive psychologist. In fact, he's a diplomate from the American Board of Professional Psychology. He and his wife, Marianne Zimmerman, are co-founders of a company called Mindability. It's a behavioral health training company. Well, Marianne is a licensed professional counselor. Together, the two of them are really responsible for the Roadmap to Peace of Mind series of books. Maybe you have a copy of the book that Michael and Marianne and I wrote called The Roadmap to Peace of Mind in Family Business. But nonetheless, this series of books has been utilized with more than 200,000 individuals. I might also add that Marianne is associated with and is a senior consultant with Regeneration. Well, the purpose of the Regeneration webinars is to answer your questions. So please, if you have a question, either text me directly or go to the chat function, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and of the Zoom page, and you'll see the chat function. You can send that chat or that question or that comment publicly or privately. Either way, I will get to your question. Hopefully, we'll have time to answer enough questions, but this is really about ask your questions. Now, some of these already came to me in the last 2 days since we sent out the notice. So I've got a question or two to just kind of kick it off with. And other than not having a haircut in now 8 weeks, I'm ready to go. Dr. Cofield, are you ready?
Ready to go.
To start. Boy, we're off to a rapid start here on that one. So, okay. Well, I'm going to call you Mike, if that's all right with you. So, Mike, you and I share a friend, Dr. Connie Mariano, and you were recently on her radio talk show. I happened to listen to that program. For those of you that don't know, Connie Mariano is the White House doctor for 4 presidents. Fascinating background, wonderful, wonderful book. And now she does a radio program. I think it's once a month. But she said something that I think caught you, at least something that initially caught you off guard a little bit. So what was that?
Well, if you know Dr. Mariano, she's a real sweet person, incredibly intelligent. So I expected something a bit more academic from her, like what's the definition of this, or what's the prevalence of that. But her very first question, I'm sort of blocking her exactly on it. Marianne, how did she put it? What? Okay, I didn't hear what Marianne said.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, it was something to the effect of how the hell are we going to get through this? That was kind of her response, and it kind of caught me off guard. And I did have a thought that popped into my head, however, since I've had a chance to think about it, wasn't such a bad answer, I don't think. And the answer was, how are we going to get through this? And the answer is some better than others. And along the lines of what Jim's talking about there, you know, you're so an incredible situation that we're in. Nobody's going to go unscathed. The primary dynamic of depression is loss. There's not anybody in here who hasn't lost something in some important aspect of their life. But I think we probably all agree, I hope we do, that at some point we're going to have a renormalization. Things come back to normal and on some level. And the problem is that it's not going to be evenly distributed. You're going to have some people who come back and they're going to be just fine, and they're going to go back to their normal way of living. There won't be that much disruption. You have some others, I think, who are going to, they may even do better, actually. I keep hearing people talk about spiritual reawakening and getting closer with their families and that sort of thing. And if that happens, then there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth, and people actually do come out stronger. And so we hope that that's true for a lot of folks. But there's going to be a lot of others who don't fare so well and end up suffering. And the problem is you can't tell by looking right now. We won't know this until sometime down the road. But a lot of it's going to have to do with the level of personal resiliency that they have in their lives, and how badly that's been damaged up to now for some of them.
Well, you mentioned resiliency. Why don't you talk a little bit about resiliency? What is resiliency?
Well, is Kevin online today? I don't know if he is or not. Okay, yeah. I actually liked what Dr. Gillen said last time. He described it as kind of a psychological immunity, and I think that's one way to think about it. I guess I would put it this way. I would add a couple of things to the typical definition, which is the ability to bounce back. And I would say resiliency is really a fundamental need, a psychological and physiological need. And if you don't have enough of it, bad things happen. But that's one part, it's a need. The second part of it would be that it is it's based on a kind of a learnable skill set. And that's a very important notion, because if it's not learnable, why even talk about it? If it's not something we can do about it, why does it even matter? So that's important. And that skill set is then what enables, folks to be able to bounce back, to be able to address all the pressures and stresses that they face in a flexible and an adaptive way. That's kind of how I would characterize it.
We hear so much about resiliency, and it's kind of a popular hot term right now in the field of mental health and, well-being and such like that. And so, say that again. How do we think about resiliency? Is it as simple as just bouncing back?
I think Marianne is signaling me or you one to try and say something.
I want to add a little something here. There's a quote that I think speaks to what you were referring to, Jim, and it's by Dr. Dean Becker out of the Harvard Business Review. And he wrote down here, more than education, more than training, more than experience, a person's level of resiliency will determine who succeeds and who fails. It's true in the boardroom, it's true in the Olympics, and it's true in the cancer ward. And I think that really signifies that it's kind of the glue that holds everything together when it seems like everything's coming apart. And there's so much coming apart right now. It's everybody's going to need it.
Well, so some people seem to have more resiliency, if there's such a thing, if it's a continuum, more or less, or is it a on and off? But Marianne, what is the source of resiliency? Why do some people seem to do better and bounce back faster, or where others don't bounce back at all?
Well, you're right on target, Jim. Some of it is hereditary. About 50% of our resiliency comes from our parents. But a huge portion, about 40%, is actually within our control. And it's learnable, which is really good news. As I said, so much is out of our control right now that everybody can do things to help build their own resiliency.
Okay. So we have a question here, and it is, how do you build or strengthen your resiliency?
That's a complicated question because it involves a number of different areas. And as we proceed on, I'll describe a technique or a tool that you might be able to use, or you can use. And you can even start using it today if you want. That has been shown to help begin to boost that. But it's not one single thing, it's a number of things together that make that difference, and how that works. But if we have focused on 4 pillars that we think are particularly important. But if we had to pick, say, 1 or 2 of those pillars, I don't know what you think, Marianne, but I would probably say right up there at the top, one of the ones that's more important than almost anything else is one's degree of social connectivity we have with other people. For example, if you ask me, Jim, to pick somebody here on the screen that I don't know, and just have no knowledge of whatsoever, and tell me what their level of resiliency was, that'd be hard to do because I don't know anything about them. But on the other hand, if I could get one question answered, I could predict their level of resiliency with, not perfectly, but I could predict a fairly significant piece of it. And that question that I would want to get answered is, what is their level of what is the quality and the quantity of their social support network? That seems to be one of the biggest factors of all, and carries a lot of weight. And there's a reason for that. And in fact, it comes from one of your favorite authors, Jim Nathaniel Branden. Remember him?
I do.
Yeah, he talks about this issue of psychological visibility. And basically what Branden said is this, that every single one of us has a fundamental need to have at least one other person in our lives that sees us, that loves us, that supports us, cares for us, treats us with respect, that sort of thing. At least one, hopefully more than that. But without that, there's some pretty dire consequences if that need goes unfilled.
There was actually a study done.
The Cygnus?
Yeah, the Cygnus Study, which I thought was really interesting. It was with over 20,000 people. And what they found that nearly 40% of Americans have a degree of loneliness where they feel socially isolated. And it's especially prevalent, of course, with our elderly folks. But then the second biggest factor or the age range was our millennials, our Gen Ys were the second biggest group. And what they found out was that this social isolation or this loneliness kind of equated health-wise to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
In terms of its impact on somebody's health. But actually, I think it's worse than that. Social isolation and loneliness are not the same thing, but they do sort of rhyme. They do sort of go together. And we know a lot about social connectivity and how good it is for you, not by studying people who are connected, but by studying folks who don't have social connectivity, people who are socially isolated and lonely. And it turns out that people who have a significant degree of loneliness and social isolation are more likely to die from all causes, whether it be heart disease, malignancies, suicide, chemical dependency. They're more likely to die from all those causes than others are. In fact, the correlation, say, between those negative health indicators that I just mentioned and social isolation is actually stronger than the correlation between cigarette smoking and cancer. So it's a very potent and powerful
Well, you mentioned the 4 pillars, and then you mentioned you only focused on one. What are the 4 pillars?
I will answer that, but if I could just back up 1 second and just add one more piece to this part about social isolation. There is a tendency to just see this notion as having to do with just the social and psychological factor, but it's actually deeply embedded in our biology as well. For example, a lot of times when we're talking about this, I'll tell people that I hope that they become more chemically dependent. And of course, they're freaked out about that. I said, well, let me explain what I mean by that. And what that turns out to reflect is this, that when we look into somebody's eyes, or we touch somebody and we make a strong emotional connection with them, it causes a release of a very ancient hormone in our brain that's stimulated in the hypothalamus. And that hormone has tremendously positive effects on our body, and it boosts our resiliency. This is the bridge between social connectivity and the impact on our physical resiliency. People who have higher levels of this hormone actually are able to tolerate physical pain, psychological pain. Their heart rate is downregulated. They're more calm. Their mood is improved, and all of that. Do you know what that hormone is, Jim? Have you heard of it? Or I'm sure if you don't, Ellie probably does. Or anybody know what it is? It's sometimes referred to as the love hormone or the trust hormone. Martin, do you know what it is? No? Okay, you're muted anyway. Jim, do you have any idea? Okay, yeah, it's once I say it,
just tell us. It's not a quiz show, so just tell us.
You know, I think if you once you hear it, you'll probably say, "Oh yeah, I knew that." Yeah, it's called oxytocin. Oxytocin, and that's what we're talking about. Even when you and Ellie look into Gracie's eyes, both of you and Gracie get a dose of oxytocin. It actually applies to animals as well. So that's the bridge into the biology of resiliency, and it really makes a difference. I did have an instance a while back where I was talking about this topic with a group of law enforcement officers at a training session. And one of them, the chief the next day called me up and he said, "Did you tell my officers that they just needed more OxyContin in order to be more resilient?" And of course I had to talk my way out of that one. So just for the record, make sure Regeneration is not recommending more OxyContin. We're talking about oxytocin. Okay. Your other question was, what about the 4 pillars of resiliency, right? Well, the first one, this is not in any particular order, but the first one is the one I just mentioned, and that has to do with social connectivity and developing or maintaining and nurturing those positive relationships. The second one is what we refer to sometimes as building mental hardiness. Mindset, that's important. We should probably talk a little bit more about that one. And the other one has to do with what we call mind-body muscle memory. This is something Nathan knows a great deal about. And then the last one is the importance of sparking positive emotions and the impact that we now know that positive emotions have on our bodies and our overall level of resiliency.
So the pillars are social connection, mental hardiness, mind, body, muscle memory.
Yep.
And sparking positive emotions.
Correct.
Okay. So a lot to get in on that, each one of those. You focused in on the social connection, but where does this sparking positive emotions, Mary Ann, where does this fit into resiliency?
Well, I would say, you know, there is so much research out there about what negative emotions do to us. Of course, that was a survival instinct as we were going through the eons of time. You know, if we were under a threat, that fight or flight response, negative emotion, would cause us to kind of rally and either fight or flight. But there has recently been a lot of research done on what positive emotions do for us. And it actually broadens and builds our perspective. We actually see things more alternatives than we normally don't see. And it also has really great health benefits. And one of the positive emotions that I think is the easiest for people to kind of grasp, because, you know, there's awe, there's love, but there's been a huge amount of research done on gratitude and finding things to be grateful for.
Okay, great.
If I might add, just one really interesting study, it has practical implications for you. They did a study with physicians, doctors, and divided them up into two groups. And they artificially boosted the mood of one of the doctors' groups by complimenting them and giving them a gift. And the other group was just the control group. And then they gave them all a clinical task. They had a chart, and they had to review it, make a diagnosis, come up with a treatment plan, and read a CAT scan. And the doctors who had their mood boosted, and this goes along with what Marianne's talking about, negative emotions constrict our view, but positive emotions broaden and build our perspective. And what they found in that study was that the doctors who were in the positive group solved the problem, the clinical problem. They all had the same problem. They solved the problem twice as fast and came up with more rule out diagnoses. And here's something very important. They actually read the scan 20% or almost 20% more accurately than the doctors who were in the neutral or negative mood state. So sparking positive emotions is a kind of a new area, but it's really important.
So I want to come back. I've got several questions here I want to ask you, but I think one of the most important, the most relevant studies that I am aware of is something called the Nuns study. And maybe you can comment on the Nuns study and, you know, how does that relate?
Well, the Nuns study is just really fascinating study. And around the turn of the last century, there was a convent in Minnesota that recruited 180 nuns to join them. And in order to join it, they had to agree to give their brains and bodies to science. And they had to fill out an autobiographical essay, basically said, here's why I want to become a nun, here's what my spiritual values are, and so on. And so, you know, over the decades, eventually all the nuns died, and all this data ended up at two American universities. And when they analyzed the data, looked at their health records and how long they lived and that sort of thing, what they found was that that there was a group of nuns who tested highest, who scored highest on a scale measuring one particular personality trait. And those nuns actually lived an entire 10 years longer, a decade longer than the ones who scored lowest on that trait. And that trait was optimism. Is that what you're thinking about, Jim? Because the nuns,
yes, I'm just saying.
Other aspects to it, but that was the main one.
Yeah, so nuns in this study had a 10-year longer lifespan with simply writing on the initial entry into the convent, whatever, they were asked to write a autobiographical, why do I want to be here? Those that were deemed to be optimistic or positive lived 10 years longer than those that were not.
Yeah.
Did I hear that right?
Yeah, that's very good, actually.
Wow.
Well, and
That's
Jim,
amazing.
one of the important characteristics there, I think it's important to point out, it's not like a Pollyanna kind of optimism, like, oh, everything's going to be okay. It's more of a flexible or rational optimism. And it's seeing things as they are, but not worse than they are. And it was that mindset that helped the hardy nuns not only live longer, but have a more stress-hardy mindset.
That's a great point, Marianne. And this is something that some people might be able to relate to. What they found was that pessimistic nuns, and that's not just nuns, that applies to everybody, but people who have high levels of measured pessimism interpret negative events in a certain way consistently. And it has to do, the way it's characterized as the 3 Ps: permanent, pervasive, and personal. So if a pessimistic person has something happen, they tend to tell themselves, sometimes non-consciously, not even overtly, but they tend to tell themselves, this is never going to change. It affects everything, and it's all my fault, or it's all your fault, and you're blaming me for it. That mindset is one that has been associated with all kinds of negative health outcomes, poor performance, poor psychosocial adjustment, all kinds of bad things.
Okay. So on this 4 pillars, I've had a few questions. What are, where can people gain more information about the 4 pillars?
Well, Marianne?
I had put in the chat that we can get that information out to everyone, but the website is Resiliency and then the number 4, life.com. But we'll make sure and get some information out so that all the participants here can actually log on and read through the pillars. We have at least 2 exercises which really help people operationalize these skills, and at the end of each pillar. So it's kind of fun. You can either do it individually or with your family.
Okay, great. So we've had another question here. Is there such thing as too much resiliency? What happens if people get too much or have too much? What does that look like? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know what it looks like because I've never seen anybody like that. I've never even thought at it from that angle because I would like to be that person.
I think we would bottle that and sell it and become
under Regeneration logo.
All right, let me get to the next question. Please repeat the 3 Ps.
Permanent, pervasive, and personal. This is never going to change. It affects everything, and it's all my fault. Think about that for a minute in terms of the pandemic. Think about what we're going through. Take 2 hypothetical people. They're equal in every other way. One of them's persistent attitude is, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. This is ruining the country and my life. There's no way I'm going to be able to recover from this. And compare that with someone who says, oh my God, this is a really difficult situation. We've got to marshal our forces, stay focused on what we can control, and we can get through this most likely. Which one do you think would have the outcome that you'd like to have?
Okay. Fantastic. Boy, that's that will make the recap on this webinar. So what are 2 or 3 specific factors that can enhance or strengthen someone's resiliency?
Marianne?
Well, I think, Michael, you already talked about social connectivity, but this whole concept of a hardy mindset.
But let me interrupt one moment. How do we socially connect? Here we are on a Zoom call with, give or take 50 people around the country. How do you connect? What's the best way to do that when we're all self-isolating and quarantined?
I don't know the best way, but I think you're doing a good job by sponsoring these kind of things. I think people are really turning to the digital world even more so, even like myself, who's a complete idiot when it comes to this. I'm being forced to reach out and do things that I wouldn't normally do. Marianne, what would you add to that?
Well, I would add, the whole concept of Zoom or video conferencing, it's very interesting. Michael was talking a little bit ago about the hormone oxytocin, and we know that that is best transmitted or best evoked with personal contact, whether it's a hug or physical interaction. But Paul Zak, who's a psychologist that's done a lot of research on this, said that it's about, you can get about as 80% of oxytocin through video chat or through Zoom cocktail parties or dance parties. And the main criteria for that is the eye contact. So it doesn't work so much over the phone, but if you can FaceTime or Zoom whether you're reading a book online to your grandchildren, anything like that, where you're having that eye-to-eye contact, you're still releasing that really good hormone of oxytocin.
Ellie, I can't tell. Did you have a question? I thought I saw you raising your hand.
Yes, Marianne was interrupted, but I wanted to make sure we did understand that. Talk a little bit more about what mental hardiness is. And then I think you were going to also tell us some other ways we could evoke oxytocin.
Okay. The mental hardiness notion is right up there with social connectivity in terms of its importance. It's huge. And probably the best way to do that is just let me describe a study that was done back in the 80s that actually has just as much application today that it did back then. But it's a fascinating study. Some of you may have been aware of some of it. It was called the AT&T study. And if you've been around long enough, you remember when AT&T was this highly regulated government monopoly, too big to fail. Congress stepped in and said you have to deregulate. Well, when they did that, that was like taking this huge cauldron of toxic stress and just pouring it on a industry that was already reeling. They became so worked up about it that they commissioned a study with the University of Chicago, a longitudinal study. That study lasted 12 years, and at the end of the study, half the people had lost their job in it. But there were two major findings that came out of it, one of which was quite surprising. The first finding was that when they looked at all their health records and all, the vast majority of people in the study had significant uptick: heart disease, suicide, diabetes, chemical dependencies, right on down the line. But there was a smaller group, about a third of it actually, that didn't experience, even though they faced the same circumstances, they had the same situations, there was no difference in terms of that. They didn't experience any of those bad consequences. In fact, they rather thrived in the setting. If they lost their job, they got another one. If they stayed with the company, they moved up. But in any case, they didn't experience any of the negative effects and all. So what was, I think, so interesting about this study is that the scientists at the time did something you hardly ever see. And they basically said, it would be interesting for us to know why this group's defense mechanisms failed and they didn't do so well. But it's even more important, more interesting for us to know what this other group had that allowed them to face the same circumstances and actually thrive. I think you can see the corollary between what's going on now and that particular study. And when they looked into it, they found one single factor that made all the difference, even when they controlled for everything else. There was one factor that stood out. And it's just what Jim has been asking about and Ellie's asking about here. And it was a mindset factor they called mental hardiness. Okay? But underneath that, there were three components to it. And they became famously known in the literature as the 3 C's. And they stand for commitment, control, and challenge. And what it meant was this, is that the group that had the high levels of resiliency in comparison to the other tended to set goals, short-term, immediate goals, long-term goals, and they were more passionate about achieving their goals. So that was one thing, they were goal-directed. Second thing was, under the control factor, interestingly enough, the highly resilient folks tended to believe they had more control, even when they didn't. None of them had any more control than the others did, but they believed they had control. And that belief was very protective for them. And the other part of that was they tended to focus on things they could control. They didn't go down the rabbit hole of catastrophizing about the future, ruminating about the past. They tended to stay focused on things. And the last part was challenge. And the challenge meant that they tended to see the stress in their lives as a challenge to be dealt with or overcome, whereas the others more or less saw it as this overwhelming cascade of chronic daily hassles that they couldn't do anything about. And this was one of the precursors, I think, to this whole interest in optimism, the optimistic attitude. And I just want to reiterate again what Marianne said, is that not talking about Pollyanna optimism. Don't worry, be happy. No, no, no. That's not what we're getting at here. We're talking about the kind of hardcore optimism, looks at life like it is, but not worse than it is. That's the issue with mindset. And those who have higher levels of that just do better in virtually every area of life, not just health, by the way. You would like to hear a brief business example. Consider this: MetLife. I don't know if you know who that is, but that's a big, most of you know, that's a big life insurance company. And they were losing tens of millions of dollars on overhead trying to keep their life insurance sales force together. And so they contracted with a fellow by the name of Martin Seligman, Dr. Seligman, who's really one of the pioneers in positive psychology. Well, the first thing he did, he gave them all an optimism test that he had devised. And then he just analyzed that data. And what he found was that the top 10% of the optimists outsold the bottom 10% by 90%. So he recommended hire optimists in addition to your other criteria. Said hire optimists, and they did that. And within 2 years, more optimistic group outsold the others by 58%. So mindset matters.
So I've got several questions, but I want to come back. It's kind of tough to be an optimist right now.
Well, it absolutely is, Jim. And, you know, one of the things that I think most people don't realize, that we humans are hardwired to, you know, stand for negative things. Like I had mentioned before, kind of that's part of our survival mechanism. And we're hardwired to feel negative emotions much more deeply than we do positive emotions. So you really have to try and work yourself out of that negative mindset.
Yeah, so just a brief example that makes this point, because that is so important to understand that we have a hardwired negativity bias. Just imagine you're walking down the road and you see a $100 bill. Of course, you're appropriately socially distanced on the sidewalk there, and you find a $100 bill. There's nobody there to claim it. It's yours to keep. Probably everybody online here would have a little twinge of a positive emotion, because we'd rather have 100 than not have it, right? So now fast forward about a month or a week, however long, and you open up your wallet, and now you're missing $100. You'd have a negative twinge of emotion at that point. So the question I have for you, and then I'll answer it, is which one would be more intense, the positive intensity or the negative intensity? The answer is the latter. And that's because even though its impact on your net worth would have been identical, you know, that's why when the stock market goes up 1,000 points, we're happy about that. When it goes down 1,000 points, we're really unhappy about that. And that's a part of human nature. And, you know, it sort of goes at your question, Jim, which is, why is it so hard for us to do it? Why is it so hard for us to do that? And there's a reason for it. There's a reason why we're that way.
So I want to make sure we save a few minutes to talk about the survey that everyone received a copy of. But I want to go back to something. Question, and of course, you don't need to really comment on this one too much, but we're talking about socialization, socializing, and stuff like that. One of the comments that I received here, I won't say who it's from, Pennsylvania or anything, but there are plenty of protests that we can go to socialize. So just putting that out there, there are ways to still socialize for some people. Great comment. On a more serious note, I'll read it to you verbatim. Considering pro athletes or combat veterans who perform remarkably well in their respective role, but transition to private sector is extraordinarily difficult. Please comment on these two groups who have remarkable resilience while performing, but struggle outside of their teams and squads. Both groups are taught and apply resiliency as a developed skill set. So, Dr. Cofield, what comes to mind with that question? Great question.
Yeah, excellent question. What were the two groups again? Pro athletes and?
Combat veterans.
Yeah, I think that goes to the, you know, something it's something I used to see all the time when I used to do a lot of consulting in the hospital, that sort of thing. And I would meet with, for lunch at various times with physician groups and so forth. Highly talented, super intelligent people for the most part, surgeons and internists and every other specialty. And at first I was, you know, kind of taken aback because I was very young. I thought, wow, these are really smart people. But after I spent some time with them, got to know a lot of them, and many of my friends were physicians, I was able to come to a conclusion that, you know, you can be really good in one area and you can be really dumb in a lot of other areas. And it goes to the whole issue of generalization in psychology. And it's just a fact of reality that if you're highly focused on one particular area, you can master that and still not translate that into expertise or skills in other areas. And a matter of fact, when you talk about military, sometimes the skill set that it takes to become good at those things don't translate into civilian life at all. The hypervigilance, for example, and being, you know, highly attuned to threats, and hyper competitive, and those kind of things can actually work against you rather than for you.
Well, one of the things that I noticed with our military folks, and we do quite a bit of work with police agencies, and we have an effort, of course, within the police departments to hire veterans. And one of the skills that they're learning in the military is this resiliency training, right? Because as Michael said, they're out there constantly looking for threats, especially if they're deployed in a hot zone. So they have a technique that's called hunting for the good stuff. And it's a resiliency skill that they employ. And in fact, we have a tool that we might share if we have some time to do that, that's kind of related to this. But again, it helps people to get out of that mindset. And even more so when they get out into back into civilian life, you know, to keep up that practice of, you know, not letting those resiliency skills degrade, but to redeploy them into their new civilian life again.
Okay,
good.
So I know.
May I add one thing? I'm sorry, I meant to say this. Just FYI, talk about the military. The military has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the past 15 years developing what they call a master resiliency program. And that's sort of gets at what you're talking about here, because they're trying to make them, first of all, they're trying to prepare them to be the best warfighters they can be, but they're also trying to teach them some life skills that they can adapt to the outside world. One of them being, they sort of militarized the titles, hunting for the good stuff, and that sort of thing. Pardon my interruption.
So we just happen to have somebody on the call today who I know from a personal friendship that has a keen interest in this topic. Was a professional athlete with the, I hate to say it, not the Cowboys, Steelers, but also is a student of the military. And so Kurt and John, any comment that you would make to Dr. Cofield's responses and comments?
Yeah, I love it. First of all, thank you for your insight today. That's the key that we're struggling with is when I say we, there's me and other guys that have a burden. Both, we realize the similarities between pro sports and military combat veterans. And so we work together with a passion to help these men transition from pro sports into civilian life or the private sector. And we run into this, train for resiliency, but as somebody else said, their ability to translate that over into civilian life is very challenging. And we find one thing that's critical in this is having coaches or leaders or somebody in their life that helps them see what they can't see. For example, a male will take a third baseman will take a hard ball in the mush right in the mouth, still make the play, but yet we struggle with that same man to deal with his own personal struggles as it relates to their private areas in his life. And so when we help them see these things, they tend to do a better job. And so we get some success, but I love your comments on the socialization, because we find that there's a relationship, a direct relationship between isolation or struggling alone and walking through with somebody else. And you said it as well. And I'm validating really what you're saying, so I'm kind of piling on, but it's critical for them to have somebody to walk through with that knows them well, not just that they can bluff, but someone that knows them well enough to wound them. And we say that a lot, you know, as the proverb says, the wound of a friend sweeter than the kiss of an enemy. So our measure is being able is really talking to them about having that athlete or that combat veteran, somebody in their life, their wife, you know, a close friend, whatever, that people that can walk in and really help them see themselves and walk them through this transition, because you're right, they do not some of the skills do not translate well. And what they do try in the business of and in the marketplace, chain of command, chain of authority just doesn't work the same. And they're perceived so differently that they go home feeling, you know, alone, and depression sets in. And right now, the number one thing we're fighting is depression. And, you know, even outside of the COVID.
Right.
To be honest. So I appreciate your comments. That's why I said that. I've got 3 friends that committed suicide, and some of these Marines I work with, as you guys know, there's about 22 a day that kill themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And they're, you know, our challenge and their challenge is how do we reduce this, you know, to none? Mm-hmm. And so your words and your comments are very relevant, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So relevant because this relates back into family businesses and industry and economy and such. And so I want to make sure that we get to a few more questions, but I don't want to hang up. Don't want to end the call until we comment a little bit on the Resiliency for Life prediction quiz. And so if you each received it, just why don't you talk a little bit about that, and what is its purpose, and how might others use this, and any reliability, or what is this Resiliency for Life quiz about?
Well, Jim, you'll notice, just based on the quiz itself and what we've been discussing today, it's roughly looking at the 4 pillars, those 4 domains, to see how well someone is doing in those 4 areas of their life. So for those of you that took the quiz, I would say in any one of the 7 questions, if you scored below, sorry about that. If you scored below a 3 on any of those 7 questions, that's something you should pay particular attention to. But in your total scores, if you fell below a 24, that indicates some room for improvement. And as I indicated, we're going to share the information on Resiliency for Life that actually has the tools to operationalize these skills. So if you're low on social connectivity, there's some exercises within that pillar that helps you boost that. And you can start to, you know, kind of take control of your own resiliency, which is what we were talking about. It's such great news that this is a learnable skill set. So anybody under 24, we want you to sign on and, you know, get some coaching. Anybody that really places above a 25, you're doing well, but there's always room for more improvement. As we talked about, you can't be too resilient. And Kirk, what you were saying, you know, you might be resilient in some areas, but if something happens and you get knocked down, you know, you want to make sure that you have that reserve, or go back to those tools, or have that social connectivity to rebound effectively, and not only survive, but actually thrive through a tough time.
You'll notice the questions, they kind of follow as Marianne points out, follow the 4 pillars. First one, of course, is the mindset, and then the social connectivity. You can see that the items correlate to that. It's not meant to be a real sophisticated psychometric instrument, but what it is these are questions that we've asked hundreds of, perhaps thousands of people over the past years. And we sort of just have found that when people get scores below certain levels, they tend to do better, and others tend to need more work and that kind of thing. So it's just a way to organize your thinking about how you can approach resiliency.
So they could, so the business owners and employees of firms can take this quiz. And so let's say that they give it to 20 employees. What would they want to get? What would be the purpose of giving this survey out?
Well, a big part of helping people with resiliency is just consciousness raising, helping them understand the importance of it. And so it can be used as an educational tool. So you give them the thing and they explain what the pillars mean, and it's used in an educational way. What you don't want to do is use to say, oh, you're not healthy, or you're not strong, or you're not whatever. That's not the intent or purpose of it. And so that's why we never, unless people want to share them with, we never ask people what their scores are. We have a scoring guideline, and we'll be happy to send that to you, Jim. You can forward it to anybody who wants it, which kind of explains what it means and what you can do about it.
This would seem like a nice little indicator to run through some of the employees of your firm and just see, where are they? What would really have been interesting is to have this 4 months ago, 5 months ago, and now to compare it to today and see, you know, how are we scoring compared to a more normalized without the pandemic and such.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to leave you with a last word or two, but I've got one more question that popped up over here, and that's about mindfulness. What does mindfulness play into the whole pandemic, the resiliency, the bouncing back, or mindfulness and self-calming techniques?
Well, we need to get Nathan in on this at some point, but the mindfulness, see if you guys agree with me. Mindfulness is kind of this buzzword. It's very trendy. It's very hip. Everybody's into mindfulness now. Okay, so that's one piece of it. The other part of it is that there really is some great science behind this, and everybody calls everything mindfulness these days. But there are specific techniques, specific tools, and procedures. And Jim, you remember the fellow who spoke at the Family Business Institute a while back, Sapolsky. He wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Do you remember that? I don't know if you remember that or not. But in any case, he's like a world-renowned neuroscientist, and he points out that the difference between us and zebras is the fact that if a zebra gets chased by a lion and escapes it, his body, of course, has gone into condition red, hyper fight or flight emergency. But if he gets away and doesn't get eaten, then the zebra is very capable of resetting his nervous system, down-regulating his nervous system back down to a state of calm, relaxed vigilance. Well, we don't do that. We're not, first of all, we're not faced with fight or flight condition red emergency very often. We get eaten up by chronic daily hassles that accumulate over days, weeks, months, and years. And so what's happening with those is they slowly activate our nervous systems. This sends a slow drizzle of stress hormones into our bodies, adrenaline, cortisol, which are toxic to the brain in too much dosage. And so what mindfulness does, and all the other tools that fall within that heading, what mindfulness does is teach people a way of resetting their nervous system. But it's very precise. It's not just a matter of sitting down and breathing, taking a few breaths. You've got to do certain things a certain way. And if you do it, here's what the research shows. And I asked the world's authority on this, Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard University. I actually looked him in the eye and asked him this question because I really wanted to know. I said, how much do you have to practice this every day to make it work, where you can actually affect yourself on a physiologic level? And he said, 10 minutes. That's all it takes, 10 minutes. But you have to, he said, the big key to it is you have to do it regularly over a period of time. Do it for at least 30 days straight without missing any days, that sort of thing. And then typically people want to continue it after that. But that was his information. Now, does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. And I'm going to give you the last comment, Marianne, Mike, before we wrap up. We've got a minute for a closing comment. What do you want to leave us with today? What's the takeaway? If you only have one, what's the one takeaway?
Well, the one thing we didn't talk about was a method that people can use. So if I could take 30 seconds and just describe something for you to give it a try, see what happens. And it's very simple. It's as simple as can be. And all you do is every night before you go to bed is you take a piece of paper and you write down 3 positive things that have happened within the past 24 hours. Then you review those, do the same thing the second night. Okay? Then you repeat that process for a period of 21 days. Okay? And just allow nature to take its course, see what happens. Now, the research on this is very clear. Been repeatedly shown that this type of process can increase resiliency. It forces your brain to look for the positive. It counters that negative scanning. And that begins to infuse your outlook with a more positive way of thinking about things. Improves sleep, improves mood, boosts your immunity, that sort of thing. There's also a number of ways you can apply that to business and your family life as well. But I would say, give that a try. You got nothing to lose. And one last thing, Jim, you might recommend, you all are there in Dallas. You have one of the world's authorities living right there. And that's Sean Aker, who is just an absolute brilliant guy. He's a good friend of Jim and Ellie's. And he has probably isn't it the #1 TED Talk ever? Yeah. The
number 2 or 3. I'm not sure if it's number 1.
Millions of views, and he's terrific. He's funny, informative. I recommend every one of you get on there and watch his TED Talk, and you'll see a lot of overlap with what we talked about today, but very, very informative.
Marianne, one last comment.
No, I think we covered a lot of territory. There's so many tools out there, and people have the capacity to learn how to be more resilient. So I would just challenge everybody, not only for yourselves, but your children who are really, having a tough time right now, and your employees. Implement some of the information and tools that we're going to send out to you, and, just have good resiliency in your life and have good health.
Okay. Well, we wrap up another regeneration webinar. I want to thank you, Michael and Marianne, for your participation in this. It's a lot of material you gave us. I think we'll follow up with some summaries to everybody on this, but we will definitely continue to promote this resiliency mindset, and we want to encourage our clients and family businesses and really everybody that we are in contact with, the Regeneration family, to put some of these recommendations into action and see how it makes a difference. I can assure you, and I can attest that stopping at the end of the day, rather than reading about what's happening with the COVID-19, put that down and pick up a piece of paper and write down the 3 things that were positive that day. It may have been a piece of chicken that tasted delicious. It may be a phone call you got from a friend that you haven't heard from. But those positive things change our mindset, lead us to a better night's rest. We wake up with a different mindset because we've had better rest. So we're going to continue to promote this at Regeneration. And we want to say that you do that and get some of your employees to do that, you're going to have a more resilient organization as well. So until next Thursday, 10 o'clock Central Standard Time, thank you for your time and attention and energy today. And we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.